Welcome to the Cannabis Cultivation and Science Podcast. I'm your host, Tad Hussey of Kiss Organics. This is the podcast where we discuss the cutting edge of growing from a science-based perspective and draw on top experts from around the industry to share their wisdom and knowledge. My guest this week is Bryant Mason. Bryant is a certified crop advisor who specializes in organic cannabis nutrition. He has spent the last 4 years working to combine precision laboratory techniques with data science in an effort to unravel the complexities of cannabis soil and crop nutrition. Along with his work on soilless media, he also helps outdoor cultivators around the United States with nutrient management and cover cropping. If you would like to do soil testing, help with interpreting a soil test, or are interested in an online course on these subjects, his website is www.soildoctorconsulting.com. Now on to the show. All right. Hey, Bryant, thanks for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me, Tad.
Yeah, absolutely. I know you've been on the show multiple times here, and listeners are probably familiar with who you are and what you do. So let's just go ahead and dive right in. We had talked before the show about one of my recent podcasts with Paul Coxon and Patrick Veazey talking about phosphorus, and that was a topic that kind of sparked some interest in you. Do you want to share some of your feedback or some of your thoughts from that podcast?
Sure. Well, first off, I just want to say that whenever I see any research related to cannabis nutrient management, I'm thrilled because it's just so many decades behind that, and there are so many questions and so few answers scientifically, at least in the research literature, that I just love seeing that kind of content. So I did listen to it. I loved it. I think my dominant takeaway is, and I'm sure you share this, is a little bit of disappointment in the fact that all the nutrient research in cannabis production that I've seen is non-organic. And that changes things so dramatically. The target nutrient levels that those researchers were talking about were so much higher than anything that I ever see in organic living soil systems. So it was tough for me to use their target numbers to ascertain any information about, what we're seeing in organic soils. So that was my first thing. And all the research that I've been reading is mostly in hydro solutions. It makes sense from a research standpoint because they're able to control more variables using soilless media and ionic nutrients. But it's a little tough to pull numbers from it. They were applying hundreds of ppm of soluble phosphorus in one of their studies. And the interesting thing I remember hearing was that they weren't seeing any negative yield from huge whopping amounts of phosphorus, which I've sort of observed that as well. I don't recommend super high phosphorus levels, but I haven't seen really elevated soil or tissue phosphorus levels create any zinc, iron, or manganese deficiencies, at least not very clearly. So that did add up to what I've seen working with growers.
Now, when you look on Mulder's chart, for example, which shows sort of the antagonisms and such associated with various nutrients, you'll see that phosphorus does have an antagonistic relationship, I believe, with iron and zinc, I think, and a couple other elements. But yet, I've heard you talk about how it's sort of a luxury nutrient in that you're not seeing those sorts of issues with high levels. Can you kind of expand on that?
Yeah, Mulder's chart has always been a source of fascination for me because I've always wondered how it was developed, what crops they were using, because there are certain antagonisms that show up very quickly and very aggressively in different crops and not in others. So for whatever reason, cannabis doesn't seem to exhibit these types of antagonisms as quickly and as easily as something like maybe a corn or soybean crop would. So I think that probably explains the difference with the Mulder's chart. It kind of depends on how it was created. Usually, and I've seen this in other crop types, I've seen zinc deficiencies that are from excess phosphorus application. But like I said, I just haven't necessarily seen that in cannabis. Now, there are other reactions too that may happen in the soil. So with calcium phosphate is a classic insoluble precipitate that can happen with really elevated levels of phosphorus. But in organic systems, most of that phosphorus that we're applying is either through compost, soft rock phosphate, or bone meal. So it's not in these highly soluble forms that are going to precipitate out in the soil as easily. And that's why on a standard soil test, you might see a pretty large amount of phosphate, but you're not going to see as much in the solution. The only time I see very elevated soluble phosphorus numbers is when people are using phosphoric acid usually to pH down their water.
Or I just want to add on that, if they're using fish hydrolysate or something that's stabilized with phosphoric acid, I've also seen that. And then the last time I've seen it is in soil mixes that have a lot of bat guano, high phosphorus bat guano, which you and I were talking about prior to the show starting. So yeah, you can see in organics what's causing it. And that to me always really stands out when you have a really high available phosphorus number on your saturated paste. But on that note, I consistently have growers with quite low available P, like 0.5, for example, on the saturated paste. And yet we're not seeing P deficiencies necessarily in the plant, at least visually. And yields seem to be quite good still. What are your thoughts on all that?
Yes, that's a fascinating one. I've always found that phosphorus is one of the least accurate nutrients to manage based on soil test results. It helps to have the standard test and the paste test in the case of phosphate. I actually put a little bit more weight on the standard test when it comes to looking at phosphorus because of phosphorus dynamics are very biologically driven. So the general theory that I work off of is if you can have a large enough reservoir of phosphorus in your soil, microorganisms are mineralizing phosphate and delivering them to the plant root pretty efficiently. And so it's very rare in natural ecosystems and in agro ecosystems for soluble phosphorus levels to accumulate to very high levels. The other issue is in a new soil, it's been sitting in the bag. A lot of that phosphorus is mineralized. And so you might see 3 or 4 parts per million on the paste test. But as soon as you water it and as soon as those plants start growing, it usually drops. And without supplemental feeds, 0.3, 0.4, 0.5 is usually what you see on the paste test. And I've seen very little correlation to what ultimately matters, which is the plant tissue. And so as long as levels are sufficient on the tissue test, that's all I care about. So really, I have a range of phosphorus on tissue, and as long as it's in that range and ideally on the high end of that range, I have no concerns whatsoever. I will say that there is a correlation between sufficient tissue levels and what's seen on that standard test in pounds per acre of phosphate. So I really like to I like to slowly build phosphorus levels in soil until that number is sufficient.
Well, my next podcast that I'm actually recording later this week is with Dr. Carrie Peters over at Jack's Fertilizer. She's the chemist over there talking about tissue testing specifically. So we'll definitely dive into that more for listeners here really soon, which I'm excited about. But I want to talk to you about the phosphorus number on the standard test, on the Malic 3 test. How is that tied, or is it tied to the exchange capacity of the soil? And then I want to kind of dive into CEC, TCC, and sort of what those challenges are with, what we're calling living soils, soilless media versus actual soil.
Yeah, great. So most phosphorus in a peat-based media is not on any exchange sites. A lot of it's tied up in compost. And so as microbes slowly decompose that compost, it's released. It's also tied up in rock phosphate minerals and different animal-based meals, like I said, fish bone meal or just standard bone meal. And usually agronomically, the traditional CEC definition is more focused on the soil's ability to hold cations, and phosphate is actually a negatively charged anion. So it's not usually very related to the CEC. So the CEC, cation exchange capacity, is the interesting thing about CEC on a soil test, especially on peat-based media, is it's actually a calculation. It's not a direct measurement. So what I mean by that is usually if a soil test comes back, they're directly measuring how much calcium and nitrogen and zinc are in that soil. They're using a machine called an ICP, and they're directly measuring the parts per million of that nutrient. And with TEC or CEC, they're sort of synonymous. It's actually a calculation that's adding calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sodium together, the cationic macronutrients, and making some small adjustments for other bases and hydrogen. But it's a calculation that's summing all of those cations extracted in the malic 3 solution. And so the malic 3 has a pH of 2.5. It's dissolving those into solution, and the lab just adds them all up based on what the numbers of nutrients are. And the reason that this is a problem is because usually in traditional agronomic calculations, you apply more nutrients to a higher CEC soil. So in a peat-based media, you're going to see higher CEC when you have more cationic nutrients. And so you will apply more nutrients, and you keep applying more and more, and all of a sudden you've over applied. So it's a bit of a positive feedback loop. So that's one issue. So how I look at the CEC measurement is more of an almost like an EC measurement, but just for the cations, if that makes sense. Because usually CEC was developed for mineral topsoils, and especially acidic topsoils without any excess mineral salts. And these cations are essentially binding to clay particles, the negatively charged sites on clay. And so when you add all of those together, it gives you a pretty good sense of all of those sites in the soil. But in soilless media or in peat-based media, that's not really how it works. Most of those cations exist in compost or minerals, or just floating around in the media matrix.
Yeah, so I have some questions about that. So, anecdotally, when I see a high exchange capacity, I'll see higher levels of our cations, calcium, magnesium, potassium, sodium. But I also tend to see higher phosphate and sulfur levels. Is that just because on average when we're seeing those high cation levels, it's just growers are probably over applying P and S2. They're not actually tied in any way mathematically to that calculation?
You nailed it. So, when you apply to get high calcium or to get high magnesium or potassium, they're usually applied in the form of, gypsum or potassium sulfate, or even just compost, right? That brings in all the nutrients in a package. So nutrient levels tend to be correlated because in organic production, we're sort of applying them together. Even if it's just gypsum, it's still calcium and sulfur together. So you'll see both of those levels climb simultaneously. But you're right on with the math is not connected. Okay. TEC and any anion is not connected.
Okay, and then the way I've always thought of CEC is like a giant sponge. So like what's the soil, like when we're talking about actual soil here, like sand, silt, clay, ability to retain nutrients, cations. And so the higher the CEC, the more clay in there, the more nutrients it's going to take for that soil to be saturated and have a lot of like plant available fertility. So there's pros and cons to high CE soil. A low CE soil, let's say like sandy soils in Florida, for example, you're going to be constantly applying low levels of nutrients because it doesn't have any ability to retain those nutrients for the plant. However, if your CEC in actual soil is quite high, you may have to apply a lot of nutrients just to move the needle a little bit and maintain fertility. Is that an okay way of describing anything you would change or tweak in that sort of layman's definition?
I think that's a pretty good way to think about it. A sponge is a good analogy. I've also often seen like a dinner plate, and you can like only hold so many ions on that dinner plate, and the dinner plate is representing a clay colloid. I think Brandon or someone who works for you in an email to me referred to them as docking sites, which I really liked. There's only so
Mm.
many docking sites on a clay mineral, and these cations can attach. And once all the docking sites are full, there's nowhere for these ions to attach, and so they'll leach out of the soil over time. And that's why agronomically, you really assume that there's no excess ions in the soil that aren't cations that aren't attached to a docking site because they've all leached out. And so if you extract all the cations and add them up, then you have a really good estimate of how many docking sites there are in your soil. And so I think that was a good explanation. And I think it's just a tough thing to apply to peat-based media because those docking sites don't exist. It's just a matrix of peat and compost, core, aggregate, minerals, and so they're not actually exchanging in the traditional sense.
That makes sense. So it's really just a measure of your fertility in a lot of ways. It's not actually telling you what this. There's no real CEC there.
Exactly.
But one thing I don't quite understand then is if the way the lab measures it is by adding up all these cations essentially to give you that number. How do they determine in actual soil what a CEC is? Because a soil may have a high CEC but have very little cations in it, right? At a given point in time. How do they
Well,
determine that?
so they do the same thing. They extract all of the cationic nutrients and then add them up. And they adjust for atomic weight. They divide by other bases and exchangeable hydrogen. So they're accounting for a few other things. But the point is, they add it all up and they estimate the CEC. But if when you incorporate all of the cations that we mentioned, the nutrient cations and hydrogen, a soil with a high CEC with low nutrient levels will be acidic. That's because all of those exchange sites will be occupied by something, and if they're not occupied by calcium, magnesium, potassium, or sodium, it's going to be hydrogen, and so that soil will be acidic. So in a high CEC soil without a lot of nutrients, you're going to see a lot of hydrogen ions, but something is going to occupy those exchange sites.
That makes a lot more sense to me. Most of the soils that we work with are pretty close to neutral, so I don't see that as much, but that makes a lot of sense. So let's talk about that really quickly because there is that exchangeable hydrogen that people will see on the standard test, and it only shows up when you have obviously acidic soils. What does that number really tell us?
It doesn't. Honestly, I've asked Logan to get rid of it. It's a source of confusion. It's 100% correlated to pH. So it'll be 0 with pHs above 7, and it'll tick up with pHs below 7. And so it's really just a different way to look at pH. And there's no useful value to the percent exchangeable hydrogen on the soil test.
Awesome. Let's move on to organic matter,
Yeah,
and how
topic.
that relates to a soilless media versus actual soil, and what targets should be.
Great. So organic matter does involve a direct measurement, unlike CEC. And the measurement is taken from a technique called loss on ignition, which estimates organic matter based on the weight change of the soil after they heat it up to a really high temperature, I believe 800 degrees Fahrenheit, so almost as hot as combustion flame. And at that temperature, there's a lot of oxidation of organic matter. And so they weigh the sample before, they weigh it after, and essentially they're weighing how much carbon is lost at 800 degrees. In topsoil, that carbon is primarily organic matter. I believe organic matter is 58% carbon. So it's an inexpensive and it's an accurate enough technique to be widely used in soil testing. It's really the best method at scale for testing organic matter in soil, or at least estimating organic matter. And it's pretty accurate. But in a peat-based media, in actual soil, in mineral-based soils, if you go out in your backyard or whatever, in peat-based media, there's two problems here. The first is that the carbon that is oxidized is in a peat-based media is not real organic matter. It's primarily peat moss or coco coir or immature compost. Those things aren't technically organic matter in the same sense that it is in a real mineral topsoil. They're carbon-based, so they show up as organic matter.
They just behave differently is essentially what you're getting at, right?
Yeah,
I mean, they are organic matter. They're being that they're carbon based,
I guess
right?
it sort of depends on how you define organic matter, but in most, I mean, most soil scientists would characterize organic matter. At least what we're trying to get at with organic matter is a long chain carbon compound that has taken a long time to form and is fairly recalcitrant, meaning it doesn't decompose very easily or very quickly, and it provides nutrients and a very sort of diverse microbial habitat. And so by that definition, peat moss doesn't really fit because it doesn't have, it's kind of inert, it doesn't have many nutrients, it's like a totally different carbon chain than, like, I mean, this is sort of an antiquated word, but humus, is this substance, this magical sort of jet fuel in the soil. It's totally different than that. So yes, it's organic in nature in the sense that it's made out of carbon, but it doesn't give us all the plant health and agronomic benefits that true long chain organic matter does in the soil. It doesn't give us all the benefits when it turns over and when it changes form. So it's just a totally different species of carbon. So when we look at the organic matter on a peat-based media, it's really just kind of showing us the weight loss. And that gets to the second issue, which is the measurement's highly correlated to bulk density. Because if your soil is super fluffy right out of the bag, it's going to show a higher organic matter. But as we all know, that bulk density changes over time. That's why the if you grow in a pot, it looks like the soil sinks 2 to 4 inches in the first round. That bulk density is increasing. So organic matter is going to jump all over the place based on bulk density. And they make an assumption with topsoil, bulk density assumption that's usually pretty accurate, but in peat-based media, it's really not. So usually a new peat-based media is going to show high organic matter and high CEC right out of the bag because it's fluffy and is full of nutrients, but those numbers are going to jump wildly. So those are two issues. There's two more issues. I can kind of stop there. Actually, I'm going to just present one more, which is that this may be the biggest issue, in my opinion, is not the technical nature of how they tested and blah, blah, blah. It's more around what do you do with the number? Because the purpose of testing, if you're going to pay money to get a test, it's to determine some kind of action you can take as a grower. And so if there's no management action that you can take with 40% organic matter, 30%, then to me, that's the biggest issue with any metric, because the purpose of these soil tests is to take some kind of valuable information and then go apply it via action.
So it's not tied at all to the CEC directly,
No.
At least. They're totally separate.
The measurement
testing
is not.
methods. Okay.
Totally separate.
That's good to know.
Yeah, there's very little correlation between those two numbers.
So the bottom line is ignore organic matter percentage if you're not testing actual soil.
Yes.
Now, if you are testing actual soil, how does the application of compost come into play in affecting that organic matter and giving us an accurate number of what our percent really is? Because I could imagine if I applied compost earlier in the season, tilled it in or top dressed it, I take my sample, some of it ends up in the sample. The sample, remember, is only half a teaspoon of actual material when we're talking about the Malic 3. What's that going to do?
Yes. So, and that's a great point, because the first problem I talked about, which is that we're testing peat moss or immature compost and not organic matter in the traditional sense, that problem exists outdoors too, where loads of compost have been applied. So you apply compost, your organic matter jumps from 2% to 10%. You're super proud of yourself, right? But that's just measuring the carbon from your compost, which is good. It means that your carbon inputs are high, and that is one of the many variables that leads to the formation of stable organic matter. But it's not true organic matter by the traditional definition. So that too is an issue. And I worked with a lot of small organic vegetable growers, and they use large amounts of compost, and their organic matter is very, very high on a soil test. And it's also, when compost is applied, it goes through a multi-year decomposition process. And so that number is going to jump all over the place. And so that the organic matter number gives you a little bit of information, like, this soil's been cultivated, has high organic inputs, but it's not necessarily something that should be managed very closely. Even in a, conventional broadacre cropping system, the organic matter number should be looked at over, I would say, a 5 to 10 year horizon, and not a year to year number. Because to your point, there's organic matter variation in soils, as there is in just everything in nature. So you are going to see a little bit of fluctuation. You shouldn't see large, like full percentage points, but you'll see maybe tenths or even a 0.5% fluctuation year to year. So you really should be looking at it over, a 5 or 10 year horizon, even in real topsoil. So it's a very crude measurement. It's very important. We all know that organic matter is one of the most important things for organic agriculture and for soil health and for plant health, but it's a really tough thing to measure accurately when your soil test costs $50.
Yeah, so we're really looking for trends. Is it trending in the right direction? Is it moving up? Is it moving down?
Correct.
I think that's the key there. Okay.
But in a peat-based media, just to be clear, I wouldn't even worry about the trend.
Yeah, I've seen it jump all over the place based on the sample, so I tend to ignore it too. Sticking on the topic of nutrients, we were going to talk about ratios sort of versus levels, because you get these ratios of what your cations are made up of. How much of it is calcium, how much is magnesium, how much is potassium. How important is that relative to just the actual values in pounds per acre of calcium, magnesium, and potassium in terms of sufficiency?
Yeah, so there's sort of ratios. Gosh, the ratio conversation is fun because there's people throw around a lot of ratios, and it depends on the kind of test you're taking. So, for example, I look at ratios on both a tissue test and a soil test. I look at ratios on the standard test, like base cation percentages, as well as on the paste test. So the ratios that I think matter the most, I've always really looked at calcium to potassium as a ratio. And I look at that primarily on the tissue test. I also look at iron to manganese. There's another very popular one that I don't necessarily put a lot of weight on, which is nitrogen to potassium. But I think what you're asking is probably around the standard test base cation saturation ratios. Is that right?
Yeah, and also the soluble cation ratios.
Okay, great.
Too.
So yes,
yes.
So on the soil tests, a very common sort of like Albrecht-based approach is to look at what I call BCSR, and it's the percentages of cations extracted by the Mehlich-3. And all over the internet, on all kinds of different websites, there's these percentages that generally fall between like 68 to 80% calcium, 10 to 15% magnesium, and 3 to 7% potassium. I look at those, but I don't put a lot of weight on them because I prefer, when managing a peat-based media for cannabis production, I like looking at the saturated paste test. And in that regard, I do look at the percentages because what those percentages are telling you is balance. And so my general approach to nutrient management is you have to achieve sufficient nutrient levels, and then you want to work toward balance between those nutrients. So you can have perfectly balanced cation nutrients, let's say on the paste test, but it doesn't actually matter if there's just not enough food in that soil for those plants to eat. It doesn't matter how balanced it is. And so the first thing I do is I have sufficiency levels of nutrients And then the next thing I do is I look at those percentages, and I really like to see calcium generally at about 50%, magnesium at about 20, and potassium at about 20. And for those who are doing the math, that leaves 10% to be allocated elsewhere. Oftentimes that goes to sodium, and sometimes it goes to one of those other nutrients, just based on fluctuations or how you like to run your soil. And what I've found is that is by far most important. It's the most correlated to the actual tissue tests. In general, it's correlated to those standard test BCSR ratios, which are usually, that what sort of translates is usually about 7% potassium on the standard test. I do not like to go above 12% magnesium on the standard test, and I always want to be above 60%, ideally well above 70% on calcium. And usually those will lead to the right soil solution balance, but I don't manage for that standard test percentage, because it's sort of the tail that wags the dog. I go right to the pace test and I look at sufficiency and balance on the pace test.
Okay. And I want to reiterate what you just said there. I think that's really important. If the soluble salt level on your soil, your EC is low, like let's say you had 200 ppm on soluble salts, that soil, it doesn't matter if it's perfectly balanced. You're going to run out of nutrients relatively quickly versus a soil with a much higher EC or soluble salt level. So I think that's important, because I've seen some soil tests from folks where everything looks balanced, but at the end of the day, if the amount of fertility is low, it doesn't really matter. You're going to run out and you're going to have to add nutrients, and those aren't going to necessarily be balanced anyway. So I think that's a really important point you brought up. Also, as you're looking at this, when we talk about hitting sufficiency first, just switching topics here, one of the things we talked about was sort of luxury nutrients. Where do you get concerned about sort of excesses and toxicities when we talk about our major cations and ions, versus say things that, you're not too worried if you see high levels of sulfur, for example?
Yeah, great. Okay, so every nutrient, by the way, is sort of a separate topic, and so they're all very different. And how I look at each one on the soil test is they're all different. Yeah, but to answer your question, the worst cation to have in excess is sodium. It's not an essential plant nutrient, and it puts undue pressure on the electrical conductivity and the osmotic pressure that it exerts on roots. So in a perfect world, you'd have 0 ppm of sodium. There's just no purpose. But that's impossible in organic soil-based systems. So sodium as low as possible. That's the worst thing to have in excess. Luckily, it's very mobile, so you can leach it out or flush it out of your soil. The next thing would be magnesium.
If it's not in your water, I want to highlight that, because some people have sodium in their water, or they're using conditioners to their water that's adding sodium. So flushing high sodium soils with sodium water doesn't work.
Yeah.
Just want to mention that.
For sure.
Sorry.
I mean, the one thing about high sodium water, how you can manage it, a traditional method, is you accept it. This is the water we've got. It's elevated in sodium. We can't filter it or whatever. So you just water, and then you flush, because what happens is the water evaporates, leaves the sodium behind, and so the levels start to accumulate. And you can theoretically flush that out even with your high sodium water, but it's never going to get it low. It's just going to revert back to whatever your water level is. But yeah, to your point, you can never get it. You can never manage to 0 if it's in your water. So the next one, though, I want to bring up, which is a tricky one in organic peat-based media, is magnesium. And magnesium is often high, often excessive, and it's antagonistic, and it's not needed in nearly the quantity that calcium and potassium are in the plant tissue. And it gets in the way, and it can really create sort of this gentle antagonism that you're not necessarily going to see visually, but is slowing down your plants and reducing yield and crop quality. So magnesium is a tough one to manage. my approach is I like to set a minimum sufficient level for magnesium, and then I have an optimization algorithm that changes the level of calcium and potassium if magnesium's high, to just try to maintain balance, because those are always competing for one another. And so I'm looking at both the pace test, the percentage on the pace test, and the percentage on the Malic 3. And like I said, I never apply any magnesium if the percentage is above 12%, because what tends to happen is when you apply gypsum, it opens up, and magnesium flows into solution. So magnesium is one of the more complicated things to look at and manage. And it's not as easy. When you have excess magnesium, I still think you should leach your soil. You'll see those levels drop, especially the soluble levels. But you're never actually going to be able to pull it all out. The key is you just try to minimize the inputs with high magnesium. Sometimes, very rarely, I'll recommend a little dolomitic lime in a real topsoil, but never in a peat-based media. And so really the only two sources of magnesium I'm ever recommending might be a little bit of like a potassium magnesium sulfate. It's an organic mineral. I call it langbeinite as the mineral name, but there's different trade names like K-Mag or Sulpomag.
Yeah.
And then otherwise, I think Epsom salt as a foliar is a great way to just give small amounts of magnesium to your plant as needed, based on visual symptoms or tissue tests. And you're never applying it to the soil to push those levels up. So I like running that a little bit low and maintaining plenty of sufficiency and more of a weighted balance toward calcium and potassium.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything you said. I always run magnesium low in our soils because I know it's so easy to add via Epsom salt and affordable.
Exactly.
And we'll actually, on occasion do Epsom salt drenches, just like a tablespoon per gallon of water, when we see that magnesium level drop. But I like the foliar idea too. That's really interesting. I wasn't aware of something you could really flush very effectively. And I assume if you did, you're also going to have to add a lot of fertility back in, because you've absolutely flushed the more mobile nutrients out too, like phosphate, nitrogen, potassium, things like that, sodium.
Yeah, and everything on the pace test is going to be mobile because it's floating. It's not real. So when you leach heavily because you have an excess of something, everything is going to go down. It's sort of like a hard refresh. So, for example, when I see something, sodium maybe over 45 parts per million on the pace test, the soil doctor tool will recommend, or my recommendations will recommend leaching your soil, and that'll flush everything. And then you're going to reset, retest, and reamend. And that over the long term is a far better approach to plant health than just continuing to push. Now, sodium, some strains and in some operations, sodium is okay. It's not toxic. It's just going to create excess osmotic stress on the plant. So you're getting more efficient metabolism when it's lower.
The plant's having to work harder in that soil to access nutrients, essentially, is what you're saying.
Correct. And there is, in certain crop species, like a substitution effect that happens where it starts using sodium instead of potassium, which is less efficient metabolically.
Oh, I wasn't aware of that. That's interesting. Well, then let's move on to touch on some of the other minerals here. You've talked about magnesium and sodium so far. What's another one that, you've talked about two relatively, antagonistic ones that we want to monitor. What's another one you want to sort of discuss?
And the other thing, just to mention on these cations, is a lot of them are influenced by more than the levels and the balance. They're influenced by evapotranspiration and irrigation technique and root size. And so I can't stress enough that it's really, really, really valuable to use tissue testing to validate, because oftentimes you can have enough calcium, but you don't see enough in the plant. And it's a different issue you need to address entirely, like watering, or maybe your relative humidity or your VPD. So tissue testing is really a good way to make sure that there aren't other issues with nutrient uptake. But to talk about other nutrients, I mean, nitrogen is a fascinating one, um, in the sense that I do think of all the nutrients, I generally recommend maintaining fairly stable concentrations. That's the goal in organic production. Um, there's a lot of things happening. The microbes are breaking down amendments and releasing nutrients. The plants are uptaking them. Nutrients are being sort of leached to the bottom of your beds when you water. So there's a bunch of different things happening, but the goal should be to really try to maintain consistent levels, sufficient levels throughout the entire round of most nutrients. But nitrogen's a little different in the sense that um, it's going to be taken up quickly and in high quantities by the plant. And generally speaking, I like to have high but not excessive levels through veg, and I like nitrogen levels to draw down through veg, to sort of to change the carbon and nitrogen balance in the plant, with the theory that you're sort of optimizing quality or terpene expression with lower nitrogen levels. It doesn't mean zero nitrogen at all, because you still need nitrogen for plant metabolism and protein synthesis and flower development. But a lot of that nitrogen is actually being moved from the plant's existing tissue. So there's already a lot of nitrogen that's taken up through the plant cycle that the plant is then using in flower. And so nitrogen uptake really goes down, and you can create some issues by running nitrogen too hard too late in flower. And so that one is interesting to me, because I do think that should be measured, and it should be managed a little bit differently, by not necessarily maintaining the same concentration through the entire cycle.
Yeah, we do see that. When you have high nitrogen, you'll have very like larvae plants that just won't yield, and they'll be super dark green. We do see it, but rarely, because most of the time we can control nitrogen through flushing. So if you do have too much nitrogen, it's pretty easy to lower it. But one question I did have for you that we didn't answer was, for people who do want to flush, how much water do you recommend by volume to run through an average soil?
Well, so one thing about flushing is I don't think it's great to do in the middle of a round. Sometimes you have to. If you have a really good draining soil, then go for it. But I also think that it can create more harm than good if your soil doesn't necessarily have high drainage capacity. I like to wait until after you harvest to leach. And there's no magic way to do it. I mean, one way to do it is you just water your beds or your pots, and you just measure the EC of the runoff. And I generally say, just wherever your EC is, keep watering until it's 50% of where you started. That's one method. The other method would be I just say, like, water until like 6 inches or 12 inches run out of the bottom of the pots or the beds. It really depends on the severity of what you're dealing with. So if you are, if you failed for heavy metals, or if you have 150 ppm of sodium on the paste test, and you just want and like I said, a hard refresh, then just really go for it until you get a foot of runoff or something. So it really kind of depends on the severity. There's no magic number that necessarily. It's really depends on what you're trying to do.
Yeah, I guess for me, the situations where I may want to leach mid-round is where I get a soil test back from a commercial grower who's, mid-flower, plants aren't developing. I see on this test they've got 300 ppm of nitrates in there. I feel like, and then I'm going to have a conversation like, hey, we're going to get a yield, but it's not going to be the yield that you want. Do we stress the plant by overwatering it, where it's going to, you're potentially impacting the biology of the soil, you're killing some root hairs, you're causing plant stress, but you're going to lower that nitrate level? What's better, I guess, is the scenario there. And what would your thought be with a hypothetical like that?
I think it just totally depends on the composition of the media. If it's like a horizontal system or something that just, I don't know, something that's not, well, that's not true. If it was a horizontal system, I would still what I would probably recommend mid-round is to do a slower leaching event. So to do like multiple pulses that are sort of pushing the water like this, but still pulling air into the profile between each leaching event. So instead of just one, like, 4-hour irrigation set, I might just say water to run off 6 times in a row. That's one idea. I don't know what I
In
would do.
one
I think I
day,
would need
or
more
would you?
information.
Okay. Are many people doing a horizontal system? Honestly, we don't work with anyone that grows like that. I know it's somewhat popular online, but I feel like the challenges with watering, like you mentioned, and fertility sort of move me away from it.
I know that several people who have received soil recommendations from me are using it, but I'm not actively engaged having conversations with them on a weekly
Hmm.
basis. But yeah, I've heard a lot of people doing it. I also just think like I've mixed media doing tests that is extremely porous, and I've mixed media where I incorporate 5 or 10% of my topsoil from my farm and changes the drainage dramatically. So yeah, I think you can
Sure.
leach. I just get a little bit nervous about it because um, everyone has a different situation. But I think in pots, when you have a true peat-based media in pots, I think drainage is fine. You just water until you get heavy runoff, and there's no issue whatsoever. But I think it's something to be aware of. I just want to mention it.
No, that's a good point. I think just for listeners, like if we're talking about pro mix, that's a very different conversation than talking about something that's, oh, I don't know, like you said, has actual topsoil in it and is some sort of horizontal system that's not going to drain the same, that you're going to have some perched water challenges and other things with water movement through the media potentially. Yeah. Okay, well, enough on that. Let's move on. Was there anything else? I know we could probably do a whole podcast just on nitrogen, but was there anything else you wanted to touch on besides the fact that nitrogen really needs to be managed and you can absolutely have too much?
Um, wow, there's a million things we talk about. Amino acids are interesting to me from a nitrogen standpoint. Um, and I just think that the only other thought I want to throw out there for folks is when you're using organic nitrogen amendments, all of them, including amino acids, have to go through the nitrogen cycle. I think maybe even on the last podcast here, for the last several years, I generally thought, and I had been told from other experienced agronomists and consultants that amino acid uptake is much more metabolically efficient, and it saves the plant an enormous amount of energy because the plant doesn't have to convert nitrate back into amino acids to create plant tissue. It just uses the amino acids directly. And my thinking on that has actually evolved quite a bit.
Hmm.
And I don't actually think that plants are uptaking amino acids in significant quantities at all because I've reviewed a lot of the research on amino acid uptake, and I actually think most of it's getting converted into ammonium and then nitrate. The plant takes it up and then it gets converted back into amino acids. So it is true that theoretically you get a huge metabolic savings if the plant uptakes amino acids. But my belief is that the microbes feed first in the soil. And so they're going to take those amino acids and convert it into nitrate. The reason I like amino acids is because of the particle size. Either they're in liquid form or they're in a powdered form that you can feed, and they're very quickly available. And so it really gives you more control as a grower when it comes to nitrogen management. And I also want to mention that all organic amendments are amino based. They're all protein based. So they're enzymatically broken down into amino acids. And so even when you apply alfalfa meal, that is a sort of amino based source of fertility. It's just a much larger particle size that takes longer to break down in the soil microbially. So that's sort of an interesting thing to me. I think more about particle size than I do about the source of the nitrogen, whether the label says amino acids or whether the label says soybean meal, for example. And so my thinking's evolved on that a bit. I don't know where I was going with that other than, the nitrogen cycle. So the other thing I think growers need to think about is when you apply a huge amount of amendments, organic amendments, that microbial action that breaks those amendments down is consuming a lot of oxygen. So the reason that it's usually pretty intuitive and pretty well understood that you should let your soil cook before planting is because all those amendments are turning into ammonium before they turn into nitrate. And ammonium is really not a preferred plant available source of nitrogen. So that's the one thing. But in that process, those microbes are consuming a tremendous amount of oxygen. And that's a huge challenge for growers because people are trying to flip, into the next round as quickly as possible. And sometimes you don't have 3 weeks to let your soil cook or let those amendments break down. And so honestly, if you can never let your soil get so depleted that you're applying enormous amounts of those organic amendments, that's the best solution. You're just kind of constantly either top dressing or feeding nitrogen as the plants need it, and you never let your nitrate get to 2 ppm and have to apply like massive amounts of any of these amendments, because once you plant into it, those young plants are not going to like the high ammonium, low oxygen environment.
That's interesting because the way I've always described it, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but my understanding is as we add a lot of nutrients, in this case, we're talking about nitrogen. One, I've noticed that different nitrogen sources will create different microbial communities and different sort of bacterial blooms. Certain things seem to be more balanced from a microbial perspective, like alfalfa meal versus some of these other amendments. But I've always described it as sort of like you add all these nutrients, you've created this feast for all the bacteria, archaea, fungi, protozoa in the soil. The bacteria, it's sort of an exothermic reaction. They're generating heat as they reproduce, and that's creating this, it's essentially thermally composting your soil. And plant roots also don't like a lot of that temperature, and they may not be able to access the nutrients as efficiently. Like you said, the microbes feed first. So even if there's sufficient fertility in that soil, if the bacteria is actively like reproducing at high levels, then those nutrients aren't going to be available to the plant. And you could see deficiencies expressed in the plant, even though, probably due to, like you said, excess ammonium, root hair death from soil temperatures, a lack of oxygen. So a variety of factors potentially affecting it. So what we try to do is, like you said, you have high fertility in the soil. You go to reamend, and by having a larger volume of soil, like in a bed, when you go to reamend, you don't have to add as much nutrients as you would to that same volume of soil if it was grown in like a 7-gallon pot. So we don't have to, it's not going to heat up. It's not going to go through quite those extremes. And it doesn't need to sit as long too, in my experience.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, cool. So just to keep things moving along here, what are some of the ones that you aren't concerned about? I had mentioned sulfur as sort of a luxury nutrient. What are some other ones that you're like, okay, there may be a little too much here, but I'm not too concerned?
Yeah, well, if I had a magic wand, I would reduce sulfur, just because again,
Oh,
it's
okay.
putting undue pressure on EC. But besides that, I have no issues with high sulfur, and I actually just think it's um, if you in order to get high calcium and high potassium, you just sort of have to use. You're going to see high sulfur, and that applies to compost too. Like you're just a lot of compost, you're going to see high sulfur. So it's a bit unavoidable in most organic systems, and it doesn't create real negative effects in the plant. But like I said, if I could just wave a magic wand, I would reduce it because it's in luxury levels and it's putting upward pressure on EC. I Let's see, other nutrients. I mean, I really like high levels of calcium. I've always liked running high levels of calcium. I've never seen real negative effects from that. I have always liked. I don't want to. I don't want to say high levels of any micronutrient because you can run into issues. But compared to other crops and other just sort of target levels of nutrients, I generally like slightly high manganese. And when I see luxury levels of manganese, I'm not too worried about it as long as it's not surpassing iron and as long as the tissue test isn't showing anything super out of whack. Um, Luxury levels. I mean, potassium can be pretty high without concern, especially um, again, as long as the calcium levels are high enough on the tissue test in week 2 of flower, I think having pretty high potassium levels is not a problem whatsoever. Um, I think that's about it. I don't think I want anything to be too excessive. And even the things I just named can be excessive. I literally just looked at a soil test and I recommended um, leaching because potassium was too high. So I'm sort of putting my foot in my mouth. But I think those 3 nutrients generally I like to see in pretty high levels. That cannabis plants generally respond well to high concentrations.
So some are just more concerning, I guess, in terms of their detrimental or negative effects at high levels versus others that you're like, okay, it's high, but you're still going to get a good crop out of it, I guess.
Absolutely, exactly. And obviously, we're talking about like it depends on how high, but yeah, I mean, there's a pretty big range. I guess is my point that um, the plants will do pretty well in. I think yeah, I mean, it's not like chloride or sodium or copper. If I saw copper at 60 parts per million, I'd be really worried.
That makes sense. Well, let's talk a little bit about let's do some let's talk about some of the stuff you have going on here because we've given out a lot of information here. You have other resources available through Soil Doctor Consulting. What are some of those things that people can utilize you for?
Yeah, thanks. So, pretty much my 2 major offerings of things that I obsess about every day and think about all the time. Um, Last year, I put together a course called Become a Cannabis Soil Expert, and it's a course that includes over 12 hours of self-guided video content that details really everything about organic nutrient management in cannabis, so growers can become more self-sufficient in managing their nutrition in-house. And so I've put a lot of time into that. There's a number of different modules and dozens of videos that really just dive into the fundamentals of techniques and soil targets and plant tissue targets and how to amend soil and essentially write their own program, taking control and having the confidence to do all this stuff organically in-house with data and precision, which is something that I think has been lacking in the industry for a while. The other thing that I've been working on obsessively every single day is this Soil Doctor tool, which is it's a it's a digital, I'll call it just a tool that's intended to sort of be a digital agronomist for nutrient management in cannabis. So growers enter a few pieces of information about their grow along with soil tests. And the tool spits out a precision organic nutrient recommendation to assist in making a decision about what to apply to your soil and in what quantity. And it uses a fairly
So
complex mathematical model to really determine the rates.
I want to dive into that, but I don't want to gloss over your soul course. I want to talk a little more about that before we
Sure.
move on because I've taken the course. I think it's probably the best online tool for cannabis growers that want to understand how to properly amend your soil, how to soil test, um, what the different amendments are, and how to utilize them in your soil. You give a lot of information in there, and the ability to comment on the modules, all the short videos. I was able to do it over a period of a few weeks, just kind of diving in and watching a video here and there when I had time, kind of letting it mull over and process, and then coming back to it, asking questions and things like that. So, yeah, I don't want to just skip over the fact that this is a pretty comprehensive course that you've put together. I know it took, as someone who's working on putting together like a botany course and some other tools, I know how much work went into that to create.
Yeah,
So,
thanks. Thanks for your positive words. The positive feedback I've gotten from you and other growers has been really humbling. So I appreciate it.
Yeah. Are you adding to that at all? Or what are some of the things that I know you've gone back and made some changes as you're learning too, which I think is really cool.
Yeah, so
What does that look like?
I added a topsoil module. So there's there were originally 5 modules, probably 10 hours of content, and I added a sixth one on outdoor cultivation. And so, which really was my bread and butter years ago. And so I just kind of go into the different tools, techniques, cultivation techniques, irrigation techniques, and ultimately nutrient management methods for outdoor topsoil. And that was the biggest addition in the last year. And then I also go through and I update things as I learn more. I change some of the target levels as I go. I try to do that on a 6-month basis, and I only update the course when it's codified. I'll change things in um, my agronomic model or my consulting practice a little bit, and I'll let that run for 6 months before I update the course. So the course is sort of the encyclopedia, and I try not to update it too much, but I'm on there constantly. As soon as if someone asks a question or if there's any conversation happening, I'm on there that day within 24 hours. So the updates happen usually on a 6-month basis. Now, I would say I'd be curious to hear, Tad, for listeners, on a scale of 1 to 10, what is the technical nature of the course, would you say? 10 being very technical, very advanced growers only, 1 being beginner growers who have are in their first cycle in a tent.
That's a great question. I think it's a sliding scale a little bit. So, like the first section of the course to me was sort of information I already knew. Um, and no offense, but it was fairly basic in nature, just to give you a overline or an outline of sort of what these different amendments are. What are your options for nitrogen? What are your options for phosphorus, potassium, these sorts of things. And then as you get further into the course, it gets sort of as technical as you want it to be, in a lot of ways. The audience that listens to this podcast is pretty savvy and pretty technical. Like I've interviewed geneticists and neuroscientists and, people like yourself that are experts in their field. And so I feel like, I'm kind of dancing around the answer here. I think this course is for anyone who's really passionate about soil science and wants to understand the why. Because it's one thing to be able to, take a soil test and send it off to a consultant or plug it into a calculator and get a result. But it's another thing to kind of understand what's actually going on so that you can make actionable decisions. So I'd throw it I guess overall, maybe a 7 or an 8. So where I think it makes sense is either you're a hobbyist and you're super passionate about soil science and gardening, or if you're a commercial cultivator that's using organics and not working, closely with an agronomist or a consultant, or a company that can do those things for you, then I think this is knowledge you absolutely need to have. And I think that's my answer. I will add that it's not a low price point of entry. It's an expensive course because of the amount of time and energy and research that goes into it, not just in creating it, but learning the material to be able to teach it. But I think that's very affordable when we talk about a commercial cultivator. For a tent grower, it may not be in the budget unless it's something you're really, really passionate about. Does that
Great.
kind of answer it?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I have that curiosity because I don't know, what level it's at to other people. But I also think I asked that just because I wanted maybe to highlight the fact. Yeah, it's for passionate growers. It's not necessarily a dabbling course. I don't think. Maybe the first module is, like you said.
No, not at all. I think you're right on. It is challenging. It makes you think. It's like taking a course in sort of soil science with an emphasis on soil testing and I think soilless media in a lot of ways. So if you want to understand why the local agronomist doesn't give you a good recommendation for your cannabis grow because they're looking at a Logan soil test and trying to understand why your potting soil is performing differently, well, this would explain it to you.
Yeah, great. Yeah, and it covers, like liquid feed recipes and foliars and various subtopics. But really, the basis and the meat of the course is organic, soil based, or I guess we should peat based cannabis cultivation. So I think people often ask, like, people often ask, would it benefit me if I'm not an organic grower? And the answer is some of the principles absolutely,
Mm.
but all of the targets and the general approach is definitely an organic approach. I don't really talk about urea or polymer coated fertility. It's very much an organic based approach. So anyway,
That's a good point. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll let you move on to explaining the tool now,
oh
because I
yeah, okay.
think
So the
that's
tool is sort of
another
an
interesting thing.
extension. Yeah, the tool is an extension of this general philosophy that comes from the course too, which is test, don't guess. My approach with the course and with this tool is to recommend only what's needed to improve plant metabolism. So this tool will, you enter information about your grow, your soil tests, and it does this complex mathematical calculation to determine amendment rates. And it's the opposite of the traditional kitchen sink approach, in which we throw every biostimulant, enzyme, ferment, microbe, and nutrient at the plant and hope for the best. So growers can still do that. You can apply your special sauce, whether that's a fungal compost extract or a high-end silica foliar or a micronized calcium or KNF
Mhm.
ferment, whatever, in addition to the amendments from the tool. But the tool is really supposed to hit the low-hanging fruit, and it does so with data and precision, because the industry has always been so full of, like, Blood Blaster RX for terpenes or biocatalyze for microbes or whatever, fulvic biochar
Yeah.
sprouted CalMag foliar. So, I do a lot of things when I grow cannabis and in my orchard that are beyond just the bare minimum. I love a lot of that stuff, but I guess my point is, you have to start with the fundamentals first. You have to make sure that nutrients are sufficient, available, balanced, before all of that other stuff. And so this tool is really intended to make very accurate recommendations to make sure that all of the macro and micronutrients essential for the plant are in your soil in the best way possible.
Yeah, I think I want to go back and highlight what you just said, because that's so important. I see companies marketing product based grow methodologies all the time, like add this product, add that product. And you can absolutely do that. And like you said, you can use all of these ferments and other things. But at the end of the day, if you don't have sufficiency in major, your major nutrients, it's not going to matter. That's going to be your limiting factor of growth. So I always start with, what's my limiting factor of growth? And if it's fertility, I want to figure out what cation or anion it is. And then if you apply some sort of pumpkin extract and you get a plant response, I want to figure out why, rather than continuing to buy a product that's mostly liquid and probably overpriced. I want to know what is in there that's making a difference, because it means you have something that's limiting your plant's health or growth. And so start with sufficiency, start with a good foundation, like you said. And something that's interesting, because when I first started, I started off using these soil calculators. The initial ones were based off of getting nutrient density. So not necessarily optimal yields when we talk about cannabis, but just an overall sufficiency or not even sufficiency, but higher levels of nutrient fertility to make sure that grown edible crop is going to be healthier. Sort of the Steve Solomon's approach, essentially. And I found it worked. It works okay. It works fine, and you get some good information from there. And those calculators, are not bad. And then I've seen other calculators come out for cannabis too. But for me, there's more information I want than just what's on a soil test when I'm evaluating a garden and trying to make amendment recommendations. And the tool that you put together has other variables associated with that. And so, can you kind of talk about what those are and why they're important?
Yeah, sure. So when I think about, I just want to step back. And when I think about photosynthesis, I think about light, I think about CO2, water, temperature, and nutrients. And this tool is only focused on the nutrient part of it, helping growers understand and apply nutrients in a better, more precise way to focus on that bottleneck of photosynthesis. So if your environment's off, this tool isn't necessarily going to help. If you're not watering correctly, this doesn't it's not going to address that. And I think that you've been really good at pointing out that this isn't a panacea for growing. It's not like an automated, it's not going to solve all your problems. But the idea here is it's focused on nutrient management. So the variables, when you go into the tool, you set up an area and you choose whether you're indoor or outdoor because that matters. You also choose your cycle length because the tool changes nutrient levels slightly depending on if your plants are going to be in the soil for less than 12 weeks or longer than 16 weeks. So for example, the nitrogen amendment quantities are increased a bit for a long-term or full-term crop versus a soil intended for like a 9-week flower. I'll add that the difference here is relatively small because, like I said, I like to maintain concentrations as opposed to trying to preload too heavily. But there's a happy balance that the tool is trying to achieve there. It also asks you for your soil volume, which is a big deal. As anyone who's grown in a 7-gallon pot versus a 30-gallon pot, there's a difference there. And the tool actually takes your soil volume and it outputs the quantity of amendments for your entire soil volume as well as per just a cubic yard of soil. So you can kind of choose which way you go there. And then it also, when you're setting up an area, asks for your compost. And this is an interesting conversation that we've had, Tad. Compost might be the biggest variable in living soil nutrient management because all composts are wildly different. So the tool asks for the nutrient levels on the compost from a compost analysis, which most growers don't have, and that's okay. And if you don't have it, it asks for what the compost is made out of. So at least it can make an estimate. It can model the nutrient numbers based on the feedstocks of that compost.
Yeah,
So
that's.
yeah, go ahead.
I just want to add to that because one of the things we're going to talk about was soil recipes, but I don't think we have time. But the one thing I want to highlight there is that I see people in forums still all the time saying, "Oh, I'm going to run Mike's mix or John's Bloom mix or whatever." But really, all of these online soil recipes are going to be somewhat inaccurate just because they're all going to be sourced from different composts. So if you really want to formulate a soil or a potting soil or a media correctly, it needs to start being formulated around what fertility is in your compost. So I just wanted to throw that out
100%.
there.
Yep, 100%. A compost made out of fish and hardwood aged for a year versus a compost made out of yard waste turned 6 times in 6 weeks in middle America versus a compost made out of lobster waste on the East Coast. The nutrient profile between those three is striking. The difference in the nutrient profile is striking. So yeah. And then the only other thing that you would enter in the soil doctor tool in the area section is your preferred nitrogen sources. So growers get to choose up to 4 nitrogen amendments that the recommendation will use. Our default is usually to use 4: soybean meal, alfalfa meal, granular poultry manure, and blood meal to optimize nitrogen release rates and microbial diversity. But it doesn't really matter, honestly. Like, I think the most important thing is for growers to do their own research and choose the best sources of nitrogen for their operation and for their values. And there's very subtle pros and cons of nitrogen sources, but the point is that people can customize the output a bit based on their amendment preferences. So yeah, I mean, the inputs to the model are taking as many things as possible that influence nutrient management and trying to account for those and trying to change the recommendations and trying to model the entire nutrient system in an organic way and use data from both the standard and pace test to spit out a calculated recommendation as a guidance tool. So I like to tell people that the recommendations are guidance. It's like, okay, based on all the information I have, here's the best advice I can give. Um, and you get a fairly comprehensive recommendation with notes about the soil and precision, recommendations and a bunch of tips about how to apply the amendments. The report is pretty awesome. And so that's kind of what I've been working on. And honestly, it's like 5 years in the making, because I've just gone so deep into this that there's just a lot of, dozens of conversations. And I think I've looked at like 5,000 peat-based soil tests and done calibration experiments and taken just classic agronomic um, research and all tried to incorporate it into this one tool for growers to use.
Yeah, I had looked into doing something like this years ago, and frankly, I just realized I didn't have the brain power to calculate for all the variables that I really wanted to in a tool. And you've gotten more in there than anyone else I've seen. It's pretty impressive, honestly, that you're
Thanks,
able to
Dad.
pull that together. Yeah, and I will say, like, when I sit down with a grower or Brandon, who works with me, on that, we'll look at, because we're having a conversation with the grower, we have them send us photos, and we look at videos sometimes of their grow space, or we'll look at, can we look at photos of the plant up close if you're having challenges, plus the entire plant, so we can look at for hidden and mobile nutrient issues. We check on what their environment is, all of these different things that can affect, again, just trying to figure out what that limiting factor of growth is, and if it is indeed fertility. But barring the ability to do a full on, like, comprehensive consult, which is something that you offer too, if people want to go down that route, I think this is the best available online tool out there. And if I were a grower and just looking to get, I had a soil test and I needed to get a result, and I wanted to do it affordably, I would absolutely use your soil doctor tool. I think it's awesome. So
Yeah, thanks a lot. I appreciate it. And it's one of those things where it's like, I sort of leave it up to head growers or you and Brandon or IPM experts to like really identify the top latent viroid, or, like a watering issue. There's so many things I just can't address. I can't address all of it. So the tool is really it is intended to be like just focused on one specific area where you guys could use the tool in your more holistic analysis. So it's not, I wouldn't call this a holistic agronomic tool. It is a organic nutrient management tool. So
yeah, no, that's great. Um, well, we've already been talking for over an hour here. I could talk to you all day. Honestly, I love all of our conversations. I always learn something new. Was there anything else you wanted to share though before we sign off?
I don't think so. Yeah, we could go on and on. I feel like we do sometimes. Like even in preparation, you called me, asked me to come on, and we ended up talking for an hour. So it's easy to
Yeah.
burn an hour talking about these topics. But no, there's nothing else that's popping out in my head. I think um, something I've been really excited about and thinking just more about in general is just particle size of amendments. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and there's always the topic of water and pH adjustment, but I think we actually addressed that in the last podcast, and I'm happy to chat about that at a later point on a live video or another podcast, because those are big topics.
Yeah, I'd love to get you back on. I mean, lately, what's been on my mind is watering as well. I think that's always something that I'm always thinking about. I mentioned I just got a bunch of house plants, and so I'm learning how to water differently for different plants and different media, which has been really interesting. And then also heavy metals. Just there's so much there that we have to learn, and there's so many variables that affect heavy metal uptake that it's one of those topics that I keep learning more and more about, and I'm interested in more, because I also think about my health. Like, I mentioned this the other day on a podcast. I was in Costco the other day, and I was looking at some organically grown. What was it? Trying to remember the vegetable. It might have been let's just say tomatoes. So I was looking at organic tomatoes grown in Mexico versus greenhouse grown tomatoes conventionally grown in California, which is actually going to be healthier for my family. Those ones in Mexico, I don't really know what the heavy metals levels are. There probably weren't a ton of pesticides applied necessarily, or other inputs that I might have issue with on that greenhouse or hothouse grown tomato. I don't know. I'm definitely thinking less in terms of organics versus like conventional, and more in terms of like healthy and sustainable, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot about nutrient density. I always have. Again, Steve Solomon was, I find, a major like pioneer in that space for me. I got started with his book probably 10 years ago or something. And
Yeah.
it is such an important thing. And I'm curious if ever in our lifetime we're going to be able to quantify that. It'd be really nice to know. The other thing I think a lot about is because I know how crops are grown, um, a lot of them, not all of them, but sometimes I know what's more likely to be sprayed and what's not. So, like, strawberries, for example, always freak me out. I
Oh yeah. Yeah.
tend to,
I
but like, sometimes I think that's like a pretty pest and disease free crop. So, yeah, there's so many. It's a very complicated world when we start importing food.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate your time. Maybe that's another conversation that people are interested too, because it's something I've been
Yeah.
thinking about a lot as well.
Let me
But
leave one more thought for the cannabis community in like this era of sort of low prices and a contraction in the market and things. You mentioned Costco, and I think 3 years ago I did a big fun project with a massive organic blueberry farm in Pacific Northwest, and I did this big analysis and spent many days on the farm walking around their blocks. Huge farm, like I got lost. I couldn't find the exit of the farm. Um, and their fertility budget was $1,000 per acre. So they were spending $1,000 on organic inputs, liquid fish hydrolysate, gypsum, microbes, like a lot of the stuff that we use. And I was blown away because $1,000 per acre is a lot. And when I asked him about that, the farm manager, he just made it really clear that when you're growing a high value crop, you can't skimp on your fertility budget. And that's not to say have an unlimited fertility budget for cannabis production. I'm not saying that, because I am a fan of precision and not throwing the kitchen sink at it. But I also think people should forever be thinking about fertility and inputs and really focusing on nutrient management when you're trying to achieve a high value crop of any kind. And so I just want to leave it on that note, because I think that other agricultural crops have really figured that out, and they don't ever skimp on their fertility budget in a premium market, even when prices are low.
yeah, that's a good point. I mean, for me, when I think about that, I think about my inputs being high quality, in the sense of like, I'm not going to buy a shoddy biochar or cheap earthworm castings. If I can find a higher quality source, I'm willing to pay a little extra for it, to know that what I'm getting is going to offer me all the benefits of what that product is. Because we do see a wide variety of, and again, it comes back to compost. Like, compost is one of those things I will not skimp on. Soil is one of those things I will not skimp on. Um, if I'm looking at two different alfalfa meals, or fish meal, or something like that, I might go with the lower price one. Or gypsum. If I can find a cheaper version of gypsum, and they're relatively similar, then I have no problem saving money there. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
good
I
soil
believe
makes
that
growing
like
fun. I
go
I
high
can't say that
quality
enough.
and then use precision to just apply only what you need, and save the money in
Yeah.
not applying excessive things, but apply high quality things. Because in a living soil system, or when you're just reusing your soil round after round, or if you have a topsoil where it's not going anywhere and your kids are going to inherit it, the quality does matter, and the microbial communities over time really do respond well to that. So I agree with you.
Awesome. Yeah, don't fall for the marketing hype that you see all over social media these days. It drives me nuts. All right, man. Well, hey, have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you for your time, and let's do this again sometime soon.
Thanks so much for having me on, Tad.
All right, take care. That was Bryant Mason of Soil Doctor Consulting, and you are listening to the Cannabis Cultivation and Science podcast. Don't forget to check out the podcast page at www.kisorganics.com. Just click on the Learn tab, then Podcast. And please take a time to leave us a review if you listen on Apple Podcasts or other platforms. I do read them all and appreciate the feedback. And more reviews help us rank higher so others can help find the show. Thanks for listening.